Thank you all for being here. As we know, AI, machine learning, is not new. But this year, with the explosion of consumer-facing generative AI products, there's a lot more awareness of the way that AI can be used casually, the way it can be used for business. And one thing I'm really looking forward to on this panel is just seeing how AI and automation is being used in such different industries to show that this really is an economy-wide transformation. So, Shri, I was wondering if I could start with you because I wanted to ask, as Experian has been an innovative company for a long time in an industry that's all very highly regulated. So, as a lot of other AI applications are kind of trying to figure out how they're going to um, be used, looking at maybe a stronger regulatory environment in the future, how is Experian kind of navigating that in financial services, credit decisions, these very important moments in people's lives?
Well, thank you for having me here, Anna. I think it's a timely question. As context, Experian is a big data company, has among the most valuable data sets on the planet. And a big part of our mission has been financial inclusion and driving impact for consumers and businesses. For us, AI is an important vehicle in driving that impact. And for over a decade and a half, a couple of decades, we've been utilizing AI to really further our mission of financial inclusion. A couple of examples come to mind. So first, at the core of it, if you look at risk-based lending and credit, it's an area personally close to me. As an immigrant, I found myself in my early days experiencing a life with my parents where risk-based lending didn't exist, and we had to really look at collateral. So using the power of AI to get much more specific and surgical in lending is an important application that we use. Now, as you do this, it's really important that we follow regulation, we adhere to governance around fair lending, and most importantly, we explain decisions to consumers. And over the last 2 decades, we've developed a set of capabilities and techniques to be able to do that. We're also starting to bring this to a large number of lenders and democratizing this. One of our products called Ascend Intelligent Services really brings the power and the capability of machine learning in underwriting and lending to a number of players across. So that's a key area. Madhu talked about generative AI. We see generative AI as having a tremendous amount of potential in really amplifying the power of our data towards financial inclusion. One of the areas we're starting to look at its application is, as Madhu said, in business automation. We have a dialogue with a number of consumers every day, helping them with credit education. And we do this through conversations with people, conversations with websites. And the questions we're asking ourselves are how generative AI can really help improve that dialogue, help us do more faster, and help consumers get educated on their credit. So a lot of potential, and I share Madhu's excitement on this space. Lots to come.
That's so interesting because there's a product element and there's also kind of a productivity element.
Yes.
And Sara, I wanted to ask you about that because in healthcare, I think some people think of healthcare as providing a service and caring for patients, but it's also a business. And you've written a lot about how AI can be used from providers and caring for patients and interfacing with them and also making their job more easy so they can focus on patients, but then also how it can help the business side of healthcare and help hospital systems, companies be more efficient and use their resources better.
Yeah, just by way of context, I work with Providence. Providence is a very large healthcare system. We're up and down the Western United States. So we've got 50 hospitals, over 1,000 clinics. We have a health plan. It's a very complex environment. We also have one of the largest clinical research presences in the country. So when it comes to sort of both the care delivery side of things as well as the non-care delivery services, the back office functions, the technology platforms that we drive for our patients and our consumers from a non-clinical standpoint around driving personalization and engagement. I mean, we touch it all, right? And health systems, while we are very complex and we are very, in many cases, very clunky, we've been using AI, sort of more classic AI, for 20 years in predictive analytics for things like sepsis detection or fall detection and understanding risk of patients in an inpatient setting. We've been using AI for clinical trial enrollment and finding folks out there in our communities who might need us. But now with sort of generative AI and and we'll talk a little bit more about this, I know, in terms of where we think things are different, we've amped up our efforts in 4 domains that kind of cross both the clinical and the business side of things. The first is just how we support our clinical caregivers. So meaning like mostly our doctors and our nurses. And the biggest opportunity area there, given some of the limitations around the existing legacy technology infrastructure of healthcare, which is one of the biggest sort of barriers, I would say, to innovation in terms of how data flows and those types of things, is around documentation. Documentation, so for folks in the room who've been to a doctor recently, you probably noticed that your doctor's charting the whole time. Like they're typing in, they may not look at you the whole time, and there are reasons for that. The reasons are they need it in order to make sure that they reflect the conversation, that they get coded properly for every piece of what they talked about so they can get paid, and so on and so on and so forth. So that also doesn't stop in that face-to-face encounter. It actually bleeds over into their evenings. They do something called pajama time, where they go home, they take their charting home with them, and they spend time. We actually have looked in our data, and we can see a spike from 7 p.m. to midnight every single night when doctors are charting. So that's a big area for us. Other aspects of the clinical work includes like proactively identifying either individuals or cohorts of patients that we can take, do clinical interventions. The second big domain is around patient and consumer. And what we're working on with those folks, really it's about reaching out to our communities, is access, so supply-demand matching, getting as many folks in as we possibly can, and personalization, so that there is a huge element of getting people to come back because we know who they are, and doing all of this in a self-service way. So self-service is a huge aspect to it. I think Madhu mentioned this, where when we're in this like productivity and efficiency forever in that sort of hamster wheel, if you will, and there aren't any more clinical workforce. So we've got to support efficiency and productivity via self-service. The third area is around back office functions. Supply chain is very complex in healthcare. Finance, HR, all of those types of functions are just like take any other normal business and amplify it with all of the other regulatory requirements. And then lastly, how we support our knowledge workers and our workforce. So with things like co-pilots and we're looking at all of these different domains and trying to experiment in a contained way while we also balance how do we deliver some value pretty quickly.
Sara, that's so funny that you would mention the kind of taking the work home, because I remember growing up, my dad was a heart surgeon, and he would come home, talk into his little recorder, and then give that recorder to his office manager so that she could type up his charts. So automation could have definitely saved some man hours there, and you see how that could really make a difference in utilizing resources. Durga, if I could go to you on kind of where AI goes from here for the consumer. Right now, these are applications that we're using on our desktop computers that we are using in certain settings. But Qualcomm is working on bringing that to devices, to being much more immediate. And I would love to know more about what that looks like now and what it could look like in the very near future.
First of all, thanks for having me here. So from Qualcomm, I think we are in this age of unprecedented pace of innovation, literally, that's going on with generative AI. If I just compare and contrast as to where we were like 1 year back versus now, it's just tremendous. But we are on a singular mission to bring generative AI into every kind of device that we can think of. Okay, we typically relate to things like smartphones and laptops, but going beyond that into IoT devices, into automobiles, into every kind of a device. And a natural question that comes up is, why? Why do you have to run it on device? I mean, what actually is the real driving reason for it? There's quite a few of them. And if you kind of think in terms of there's plenty of studies that have been done and published articles in terms of if you truly want to scale the full potential of what you can do with generative AI in the cloud, it actually becomes cost prohibitive and it's not very energy efficient. There's plenty of studies in that. I don't want to go too much into it, but that's actually a very important vector. The second part that's actually critical is what we've been calling it as immediacy. You want to have the responses coming back from everything that you're running with generative AI as fast as possible. You might or not have a connection to the cloud, and even if it is there, every millisecond matters. And in that sense, immediacy becomes very important. And that's something that you can always run on a device. You can actually immediately get that response. The third one is a little more subtle, but it's about privacy and security. There's lots of data that we don't have as much of an issue in terms of just storing them on the cloud. That's not a problem. But when you get into a lot of the personal data, medical data, company confidential information from enterprises and whatnot, you don't want everything to be on the cloud. You want something maybe on premises, but some things which are literally on the device in itself. So that matters. So there's a reason for then running it. So then the natural question is, okay, I get all of that, but still, we are talking of these very large models, aren't they? I mean, these are like billions of parameters, and can we seriously run them on devices? The answer is absolutely yes. 2 weeks back, usually this time of the year, we have a summit. We host it in Maui, nice place. A lot of people come in there to watch some of the demos. We showed state-of-the-art large models running on smartphones and on laptops. We showed a 7 billion parameter model, running on a smartphone. It was so powerful that instead of you picking up your phone, going through the clutter of your apps and trying to figure out if I want to make an airline reservation, I just talk to my phone. My voice gets converted to text. The text gets converted to this large model, extracts the context from it, retrieves the relevant information, and I have an airline reservation. It's quite something, by the way. The other one is, as we kind of go a little bit further into that, is usually when we talk of these large models, these are what are known as foundational models. They've been trained on data that's out there and pretty much public information. But there's tons of information that is personal. And so fine-tuning those models. If you have a digital assistant in your phone, in your laptop, in your doorbell, for example, and it gradually starts personalizing based upon your data, your context. In other words, if you and I have the same device today, 2 years from now, our digital assistants will behave very differently. Maybe it knows that I like one airline versus the other, and it's going to retrieve that information or something else. But those are examples of personalization which are absolutely critical. And finally, this is not just about consumer use cases. What I talked about over here was consumer use cases, but productivity use cases are becoming equally important. Co-pilots are something that people are very familiar with as they are coming up.